This is the Strike Mash Boil podcast, presented by the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club. This week we talk New England Pale Ales, judge a spiced porter, and learn how one of our members started Channel Marker Brewing. That and more, so stay tuned.
All right, welcome back to Strike Mash Boil. I'm Marco, president of Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, and I'm joined by my co-host, Phil.
This week, we've got our good friend, former club member and founder of Channel Marker Brewing, Justin Negrotti, here to tell us about his journey from home brewer to pro brewer. But first, before we get to that, this week, we have the first of a new series of segments we're calling Hop It To Me. This is going to be all about the fundamentals of hops and IPAs. Now, we've only really touched a little bit on IPAs in the first 16 episodes. We had Switzer on at the very beginning to talk about Viking Luau, and we've talked about the new IPA book on last week's show, and IPAs come up here or there and on some of our other shows.
And anybody who listens to our show knows that IPAs can be a bit of a touchy subject. People get pretty passionate about their IPAs. Sometimes when we're talking about certain types of them, and others when they're talking about their favorites. But we've heard in some of the comments out there about your opinions on IPAs, and you guys want to hear us talk a little bit more positively about them. We thought this would be a good opportunity for us to get back to the basics and talk to you guys about the things that we like in hoppy beers, and not just West Coast old school style IPAs. We're going to talk today a little bit about a New England Pale Ale, but we figure this segment's going to be a great opportunity for us to get into everything IPA, whether that's a single IPA, double, triple, English IPAs, West Coast, Vermont IPAs, all the cold IPAs, whatever we want to talk about, we'll get into it. But we want to take some time to talk to you guys about a style that you guys think we're not big fans of.
Yeah, there's just so much to talk about. And really the question we had when we started to develop this part of the show, which was actually before the show ever got started, we were talking about this. Where do we start? How do you start with IPAs? There's just so much out there. So we figured, let's start at the nice, classic, humble pale ale. A good pale ale can be the foundation of any IPA or double IPA or double dry hopped, whatever. And in cooking, they say you should have a signature dish. And in today's brewing world, you should have a signature hoppy beer. And so why not make it a nice, easy, crushable New England Pale Ale or just American Pale Ale?
Yeah, and so with keeping all that in mind, I brew IPAs pretty regularly. You guys have heard me talk about this on the show. I have a series of IPAs that I make. I call them On the Whim. Phil, you have a series of IPAs that you make. They're called
Clusterfickin'
of yours. And we thought the guys that would be best to join us is we've got Joe, Mr. Lactose, back, who happens to be one of our top New England IPA brewers in the club. So Joe, welcome back to talk about it.
Thanks for having me here, guys.
And we also have Rick, who I've brewed some IPAs with, and I just actually had his West Coast IPA recently, which was freaking killer. It was amazing. Rick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So since this is Rick's first time on the show, he has to answer the quickfire questions. So you ready, Rick? First thing that pops to your head, you get one pass, no long answers. All right. What's your favorite beer style?
Belgian Dark Strong Ale.
All right. What's your least favorite beer style?
Ass Puckering Creek.
Okay. What's your favorite beer ingredient?
Maris Otter.
What's your least favorite beer ingredient?
Star Anise.
Okay.
Wait, haven't you used it in beers?
That's why it's not my favorite. And not so much in a fresh beer, but when it ages, it can take over a beer, and I was not a fan of that.
What piece of brewing equipment could you never live without?
Glycol chiller.
What piece of brewing equipment do you think is overrated?
The condenser lid.
But don't you have a condenser lid?
I do.
And
I dislike it.
It's like putting Star Anise in a beer. He learned from having it that it sucks. So there you go.
So I would not say that it sucks, but I would say that there's some downside to it in terms of what I feel like is the potential to, one, injure yourself with hot steam if you're not careful with the way you remove some of the window, as well as tipping up the lid itself. So I tend to only use it when I have to, which is when it's really cold out and I can't open the garage door.
Which for me, I'm in my basement, so I don't have any other ventilation. So that's my only way of being able to brew down there.
Oh, and the best thing about a condenser lid, we were talking about this before we started, was it can rehydrate a barrel with steam pretty well.
Oh, great idea.
What is your dream piece of brewing equipment if money is not a factor?
I don't know. What do you think? 5-barrel fermenter?
A bright tank. You don't have a bright
tank. I don't have a bright tank. A bright tank would be a good one.
Yeah. What beer topic subject style do you wish would just go away?
Brute IPA.
Which this being the Hop and IPA segment. I don't know. Are we ever going to touch on that one? What is your
topic though?
No. What is your desert island beer?
Grisette all day long.
And when you aren't in the mood for beer, what's your go-to cocktail?
An old fashioned.
Excellent. Rye or bourbon?
Yes.
Okay. Equal opportunity whiskey drinker. Love it.
Yep.
All right, so let's get into this. As Phil said, this is our first Hop It To Me segment. We're going to touch on the humble New England Pale Ale. So this is basically the lower gravity, sessionable, maybe slightly less hopped, maybe not version of a New England IPA. And I know that there are session New England IPAs out there, but we're just going to say this is a sessionable version of it. These beers can be tough to get right and strike that balance of malt and hops and body without overdoing one or the other. So we're going to talk through how we come up with a simple New England Pale Ale recipe that you're going to want to drink every day. So the first thing that we should talk about when you're coming up with a recipe is the foundation for your beer, which is going to be your malt bill. And I will preface by saying, so we're going to assume that when you're creating this recipe for yourself, that you're going to use fresh ingredients. So it's important to know that when you're making a New England Pale Ale, these beers are drink fresh. So with that in mind, make sure you're using fresh malt, fresh hops, nothing that's really old and stale, because that's going to have a really adverse impact. So let's start with grain bill. What do you guys, when you guys are making New England Pale Ales, what's the first ingredient you guys are starting with?
For me, it's going to be 2-row brewer's malt. That's my base malt. For New England Pale Ales, IPAs, it's just going to give you that simple sugar base that you need.
Yeah, I sometimes play with that a little bit, where I might do, 70% of my malt bill will be some sort of pale malt, but I'll sometimes take that 70% and split it with 2-row and maybe like a Golden Promise or something like that, where I like the sweetness that Golden Promise will sometimes add to a New England Pale Ale.
The sweetness is something you definitely want. For me, for Golden Promise, I've made a few like IPAs with Golden Promise, gotten a little too much sweetness. But so like on a Pale Ale, for me personally, I would avoid the Golden Promise, but that's just a personal preference.
I like Pilsner. I've done a lot with Pilsner as my base malt, and I mean, you don't have to go crazy with Wireman floor malted or anything like that, but a good basic Pilsner is going to give you really great grain flavor, that kind of classic cracker type flavor. And I love it. It's nice and light. So if you're looking for that super light straw color too, Pilsner's a great place to start.
I completely agree. I kind of do the split as well. So I could do a 2-row for, 30% of the batch and Pilsner for 30. And I like the lightness that it gives. And I think it helps balance out what already can be a little bit of a sweet beer.
Yeah, the one thing to keep in mind when you're using Pilsner, especially in higher percentages, is that you're using the right type of Pilsner, that you're not going to push yourself into a 90-minute boil, so that you avoid DMS. And I know there's some controversy on that, so I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but just make sure that you're using the right stuff so you're not accidentally filling a beer full of DMS.
Now, what about Maris Otter? We touched on Golden Promise, which is another UK grain, 2-row, which is American, Pilsner, which is continental and also grown here in North America. But I also have brewed some great pale ales with Maris Otter. Anybody?
I've never done a Pale Ale with Maris Otter,
really?
Just to avoid the darkness that I would expect from it.
And so I have, but I wouldn't choose to do that with, say, a New England Pale Ale. I would do it with something else where I want a little bit more clarity, a little bit more malt flavor coming through. So Maris for me is really a targeted base malt when I use it for any of these type of beers.
Okay.
And Maris Otter's what, 3-4 SRM versus 2?
I thought it was 3.
It's in that range.
I mean, I've got one in the tank right now that's half for the base malt, half Maris Otter, half Golden Promise. So I like it. But you guys know, if you listen to the show, I like my English beers. So
we got some base malts out of the way. So, some of us like to use Pilsner, some of us strictly two-row for a base malt, some variation of some other malts in there. What about other stuff? Like, I guess technically it's a base malt, but I sometimes will toss in a little bit of Vienna malt into my pale ales. But I almost always use white wheat. Almost always. I
Same
know
here.
I don't use any other wheats. It's usually just white wheat, and sometimes I'll use oats, but mostly it's my grain bill almost exclusively is some combination of two-row, Golden Promise, and white wheat, and then maybe Vienna at times.
I usually do 70% as a base malt or a blend of base malts. 20% is oats, flaked oats, and 10% is white wheat.
My grain bill for like my standard New England Pale Ale is going to be about 80% two-row. That's 13% white wheat and 7% flaked oats.
And I'm probably about the same percentage with flaked oats that he is 7.
So there's really no wrong way to do it.
Definitely not.
Right. I like to pull back on the white, like the white wheat. As I was noticing, the more and more I was using it, the beers were actually a little darker. And when I pulled it back just a tad, it got me to the exact color I was looking for.
Yeah, and essentially what we're trying to do when we're building these recipes that are including things like wheat and oats and the base malts we're talking about is we're trying to hit that like beautiful pale golden color that we get, but we're also trying to create some of that body and the creaminess that you get from New England pale ales. So that's where the wheat and oats come in, because it's going to give you that fuller mouthfeel, give it more body, a little bit of that creaminess. And that's why we're talking about doing that. Now, there are some variations of recipes that you'll see out there. So is there any malts, so other than the really obvious shit, okay? So we don't need to tell anybody to stay away from like smoked malt, because I think people know to stay away from smoked malt. But what are some like misconceptions in New England pale ales that we should tell folks, like, don't go down that trap? Stay away from.
I would say crystal malts.
Knew you were going to say that, and I don't know if they still do this, but I know early on Trillium's New England IPAs and pale ales had a small percentage of, was it Crystal 40?
Crystal 15.
Oh, is that low? All
yeah,
right.
So it's still in their recipes that I've looked through a lot. Believe me, I've extensively looked at all their recipes, and it's Crystal 15 is what they're using in theirs. And if you pour their beer into a glass, you'll notice there's a little more golden hued than a lot that's coming out. So they're definitely using that, and it adds a little touch of sweetness as well. But
we're talking like, if you were to scale it to our home brewer's recipe, we're talking 6 ounces in a 5-gallon batch.
Yeah, I'd say around there, 4 to 6 ounces. It's a very small amount.
And basically what it's doing is giving a little bit of a color adjustment, but crystal malt's pretty sweet. Like it's pretty detectable in a beer. So that's part of what they're doing to create some of their sweetness in their beers too.
Definitely some sweetness, some balancing. That sweetness is going to be balancing out some of that hop bitterness that I think that these beers definitely need, especially on the lower ABV side. When you're going into these giant dry hop rates, they can become bitter really quick.
That's Crystal 15 is a relatively light crystal malt. For some reason, I thought it was a surprisingly higher number than that, but I'm glad to hear it's Crystal 15. But so not a do not add by any means, but certainly something you want to be careful in, that you're choosing the right one, because not every manufacturer of crystal malt will give you the lovey bond of it. Sometimes they'll just say crystal light, crystal dark. So you just want to make sure that you're careful in what you're choosing, because the wrong choice there will totally destroy your beer.
And if you do want to add crystal malt, and I threw it out there as something I don't ever add, but if you do add it, start light, right? It's not the end of the world if you use just a couple ounces and you decide, you know what, it wasn't enough, and next time you add another third and add another third. I would not go to the point of like throwing in a pound and saying, all right, a pound out of however many pounds of grain goes into a 5-gallon batch, because I never brew them. But don't just throw a pound in there and expect it to be perfect. I would start light and work your way into it.
Any other glaring malts that you guys think people should stay away from? There's one that comes to mind for me, but I'm curious if you guys have any.
I don't know, based off of what all the recipes I've seen, I kind of like have a few in mind that I always go with it. So there's nothing that I can think of that I would be like, oh, I'll use this because it just seemed it automatically would probably seem wrong.
Yeah, one that I've actually tried it before, and it just didn't work, and it was honey malt.
Ah, yes,
So that would be one that I'd say stay away from the honey malt because first of all, with that malt, a little goes a very long way,
definitely,
and that's
definitely.
definitely one that will.
At least in New England IPA, stay away from that one.
Yes.
We were just talking about this on our Facebook group today, and I've got a great recipe from way back in the day of a West Coast IPA that used some honey malt, and it was pretty solid. So honey malt has a time and a place, and New England IPA is not it.
Yeah, well, and mainly because a West Coast IPA, you're balancing that bitterness, right? So it
Right.
makes sense that you'll get that sweetness from honey malt to help balance it out. But you've got a little to small IBU beer that you just don't want to be killing with that honey sweetness.
Yeah.
All right. The only time I would say I would think a good idea would be using honey malt is if you're making, say, a beer with honey in it, and you want to try to retain some of that honey flavor. It's just not like honey is going to ferment out. Like, so you're thinking you're making a beer with honey, you're not really going to taste it. So if you use some of that honey malt in there and the honey, someone might say, oh yeah, I could taste the honey. It's the honey malt is really going to work well in that situation. So that's one that can help boost up that honey flavor that you're looking for.
But like we mentioned before, a little goes a long way with that one. So use sparingly for sure.
Agreed.
So I mean, from there, right? If you think about just your basic process in building a recipe, is you're gathering ingredients. So let's talk a little bit about hop choice. So when the whole idea of building a grain bill for this is you're trying to create that balance of body, texture of the beer, some sweetness, but then you need hops to sort of offset some of that stuff. You guys want to talk about what some of your go-to hops are? And because I know everybody's going to say this, everybody knows Galaxy is number one when it comes to hops and IPAs. Phil, you're shaking your head. Galaxy is the best IPA hop on the planet.
And I think Joe we've had this conversation a lot, so he might have a good way of explaining. So I'm going to let Joe talk about Galaxy, but my favorite blend is Citra Mosaic Eldorado. I think it's a great group of hops, and in a pinch, just Citra Mosaic. Citra Mosaic makes a great pale ale, just a fantastic basic starter pale ale. You know what you're going to get as long as your hops are fresh. It's going to be great. And once you start somewhere, say all Citra or Citra Mosaic, and you start adding other hops in, then you're going to start learning what those hops are doing with your base set of hops of Citra Mosaic.
Yeah, there are what are the big three IPA hops? Citra, Galaxy, and is Mosaic the other one?
I'd say that's probably one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, it's like the really popular ones that you see everywhere. But I want to hear what Joe says about Galaxy.
Well, I love Galaxy. I feel like Galaxy got really popular in the past few years, but it kind of seems like it's on the decline. Galaxy on its own is just an amazing hop. It has huge passion fruit notes. It's kind of got a candied fruit flavor to it. But for me, it doesn't really work well with other hops. Once you
That's true.
mix in that with two other hops, it gets lost immediately. And spending $30 a pound on Galaxy, if you get a good price on it, sometimes you can spend a lot more. When it was really popular and you couldn't get your hands on it, you throw those other hops in with the Galaxy, and you don't taste it at all. So for me, if you want to use Galaxy in a pale ale, I would say just use Galaxy, maybe some Citra, but it can get lost pretty quickly. But on its own, an amazing hop.
Yeah. So the moral here is you want to find those hops that are, well, I guess you can run the gamut, but you really want to think about those hops that are going to give you some of those tropical characters, citrus characters. New England Pale Ales they lean more on the fruit forward tropical side, but there are some examples that have a little bit of balance with some pine and dankness too. So you can't have a little bit of the variation there, but you really want to find those big aromatic hops and likely stay away from those what do they call them? I'm drawing a blank now.
Well, like the classic CDZ
noble
hops.
hops.
Oh,
Noble
noble
hops.
hops.
You want to stay
Noble.
away from like the noble hops because those aren't going to really do so much for you.
I agree. Yeah, Citra, Simcoe, Mosaic, Eldorado, anything that's coming off as a tropical fruit or stone fruit flavor, and anything going into the piney, bitter, or classic German noble hop. Anything similar to those noble hops might not work so well together. It could add a little bit of balance on that tropical fruit note, but yeah. Those are some of the big ones that you want to stick with. One of the great things that I've been going through recently is the hop survivability chart that Yakima Chief and Scott Janish kind of came up together. That's kind of what I've been going off on my most recent New England Pale Ales by changing my whirlpool hops to Citra and Idaho 7 based off of that chart of being some of the oils that survive the longest on the hot side. So it's a great list of hops that you can kind of get an idea on what's going to smell and taste best and give you the biggest punch.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I know that it's a really awesome time for home brewers in the hop world because there's all this really great information, but there's also a ton of growth in the hop industry, and there's a lot of breeding that's happening and these new variations that are coming out. So this is definitely one of those areas where you can experiment with, because there's a lot of really cool experimental hops that have come out recently. And I'll give a shameless plug to one of the local folks, 4-Star Farms. They have that Chaos hop that we all got to try not that long ago, and it was pretty awesome. And so when you're looking for the characteristics, as long as it hits the characteristics that we're talking about, this is definitely an area where you can experiment with. And we were talking recently about those hops that sort of get lost in the shuffle, but because on their own they're not great, but they're great hop lifters. We were talking about Laurel on the Facebook page recently. I wouldn't recommend using Laurel as a standalone hop, but it does some amazing stuff to lift up the other hops that you have in an IPA. So you can just learn a lot of this really interesting information and play around with these combos and really create some unique, awesome flavors.
Right. And I think you can't be afraid of making a mistake here, right? I think we've all gone out and got the newest hop and we're like, can't wait to put this into something. And then, we put our Galaxy in there, and the next thing you know, that's all you can taste, right? So, like Joe mentioned, it's one of those things where when you're picking up new hops, you kind of, to the best you can, you want to look at those flavor profiles and see what would blend together, and then trial and error to kind of get that ratio right in terms of how you're using them.
And the engineer part of me says, design of experiments is change one variable at a time. So when you are playing around with hop varieties, in my Clusterfickin series, I'm up to batch 24 now. I nailed my grain bill, and the goal is to play around with the hop varieties, and I try and only change one variable at a time. Sometimes I go completely off the reservation. I change all the hops all at once, and then I hate myself for a while. But you really should just change one variable at a time, because if you change multiple things, then you really don't know what it was that either did the good thing or the bad thing. So if you start with a basic, say it's Citra Mosaic is your baseline, and you go and change everything to be Idaho 7 and Galaxy, let's say, as those are your two primaries, and you find something in there you don't like, well, was it the Galaxy? Was it the Idaho 7? You don't really know, because you changed everything from the last batch. So only change one little variable at a time when you are playing with hops.
Another tip too is if there are certain hops that are new to you, it might be better to go out and buy a commercial example that showcases that hop, so you can have an understanding of what the flavor is and how you're going to react to it. We talked about this before we hopped on the show, and that is Amarillo being a really great example. For some folks, it's really interesting. So Amarillo, for those that haven't had it before, has a similar reaction with people as cilantro does. Some people will have cilantro and taste this beautiful aromatic herb. Some people have cilantro and it tastes like dish soap. So the same thing happens. There are lots of folks that will have an Amarillo beer and it has this soap character to it. So if you were somebody who hasn't had it, but you read the label on Amarillo hops, you would think it's like this badass hop to use. we'd suggest that you go out and get yourself a commercial example that showcases that hop and try it out to see how you are affected by it.
That's all the time we have for this first edition of Hop-A-To-Me. We'll finish walking through our thoughts on a New England Pale Ale recipe next week. All right, time again for this week's beer review. Each week we're going to review a beer submitted to us by a member of the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club or from one of our listeners. Our guest judge is going to walk through the judging process as if this were a homebrew competition, and all they know is the category of the beer. This week, 30A, Spice Herb Vegetable Beer. Base style for this beer is an American Porter at 7% ABV, and this one is spiced with cinnamon and vanilla.
Yeah, so we got the doc back with us today, our national certified BJCP judge. Nick, welcome back.
Good to be here.
All right, so I feel like every time we do this with you, we seem to have like a dark spiced beer. Like it just seems to be the thing with the doc, but you've got your score sheet, you've got your beer. Let's dive in and let's get into it.
Absolutely. This style, 30A, is sort of a catch-all for anything that's spiced, herbed, or has vegetables in it. Basically, you want to kind of identify a base style and then adulterate it to a point where it kind of lifts it up or changes it a bit. So in this case, we have an American Porter that's had cinnamon and vanilla added to kind of amp up sort of those dessert notes, which is a really good idea. First of all, American Porter is a classic style, very great beginner style, very easy to do, very hard to fuck up. Adding components like cinnamon and vanilla is just sort of a natural transgression for something like an American Porter. So right away, when we pour it into the glass and we smell it, first thing I got it wasn't even like the cinnamon vanilla. It was like the dark fruits. I get a lot of raisins, a lot of currants, rum-soaked raisins. It smells great. This is a great smelling beer. I get some baking spices, obviously cinnamon, a little bit of roast, but the roast seems a little bit tamed back, and it's quite sweet smelling. But those raisins and the currants, the dark fruits, really shine through, and very pleasing to smell. I was really impressed by that.
Yeah, it's got a raisin bread, very much a raisin bread aroma to it. It's really, really nice. And I just want to really quickly say, I mean, you say, an American Porter is really hard to fuck up. I swear I fucked up a lot of American Porters in my day. For some reason, I don't know, this is usually strictly to American Porters, and I'm not getting this in this beer at all, but I've in the past experienced sort of this metallic aroma to them, and it's always been exclusively to porters. Is there something to that in porters?
Not really. I mean, you could look at
just me, just my fucking it up.
I mean, you could look at two recipes between a porter and stout. They're pretty similar. Some people say one has roasted barley, one has black malt, but there's a lot of carryover there. So I don't think it's specific to American Porter. I can say that metallic note, or that sort of, they call it acrid roast note, it is inappropriate for the style. And that's generally due to too much roast. Sometimes if your pH is off, that's going to come through more as well, and it's going to sort of taste like that. And your pH can be an issue since you're using generally a little bit of roast malt here, and you can drop the pH too much. So something to keep in mind. But like I said, it's for most water profiles and most beginners, it's a pretty easy style to kind of handle. So the appearance, it looks like a porter. It's dark, it's opaque, has a nice tan head. It looks like what it should. The taste itself, I get, first right up front, I get some cinnamon, some roasted malt, touch of vanilla also in there. The one kind of downside and flaw and why this beer is going to get knocked a little bit is very low bitterness. I almost got no bitterness at all. It's fairly sweet, and that's a flaw for the style. Most Americanized versions, and just keep in mind, the American Porter is an Americanized version of the English Porter, which means if it's America, it's going to be bigger, it's going to be roastier, it's generally going to be more bitter. And in this case, it's not really has that bitterness to kind of counter all that sweetness.
Yeah, is this brewer just really innovative? Have they now created the first pastry porter? You heard it here first. Here it comes, the new fad in craft beer, the pastry porter. Because this thing, drinking it, I'm like, first of all, it's 7%. We've had other beers on this show that have been around that ABV that burn my tongue. This thing is smooth as fuck. It's got an awesome cinnamon vanilla character. It's literally, like sort of the cinnamon raisin cake in a glass. It's super sweet, really smooth, drinks easy. Like, There it is. Whoever you are, we'll find out after the show. You've made a pastry porter. You have now created the newest craft beer fad that I'm going to shit on in a couple of months. You've created it, and here it is.
I'll disagree with that. To me,
God damn it, Nick.
I don't think it's sweet enough. It doesn't have enough of those decadent characters. It doesn't taste like liquid fudge. You know what I mean? It's more like an English dessert, and English desserts aren't known to be that sweet. I mean, there's sweetness there, but there's a lot more kind of dark fruit, nuttiness, complexity that's not necessarily just sugar on top of sugar on top of sugar that most pastry stouts are.
All right, so we're going to call this Spotted Dick Porter. That's going to be the name of it. All right, that'll be it. It's slightly sweet with some of those cinnamon characters. Spotted Dick Porter. Heard it here first. That's the new trend.
That's a great name, by the way. I absolutely love it. That's fantastic. So yeah, I mean the taste. So besides that, the low bitterness, again, lots of dark fruit notes, which is just fantastic. That's likely due to crystal malts that are added. Even the yeast strain can produce certain esters that can be perceived as sort of dark fruit. So whatever the brewer did as far as that component goes, I think that's really excellent. So it finishes fairly sweet as sort of expected. And there's a little bit of lingering vanilla as well. The mouthfeel itself, it's not super slick on the palate. It's medium body. It's a little low in carbonation. Maybe a bit more carbonation would help cut through that sweetness a little bit. But again, for the American porter, according to BJCP, you need medium to medium high bitterness. This isn't even close. I mean, this is low bitterness, and that's a real detriment to me. But other than that, it's a really solid beer. The bitterness, it's definitely an issue and kind of unbalances the beer, which is a shame because American porter is pretty all known balance. So overall, I would probably give it around a 33.
That's good beer, right? That falls under the good beer tier.
It is.
I think, and you tell me if you're saying something different, but my interpretation of what you're saying is that it's actually a great beer. It's just not in the style. Like it's missing some of the key style components to fit under that porter category when you call it out as an American porter. But the beer itself is really good. Like I could drink actually a lot of this and be okay with it.
So, Nick, I think I've asked you this before. Would a different style as a base style in a competition, would that have helped this beer?
Maybe. I mean, I alluded to the the English porter, and I feel like that might have worked. English porter also has, I mean, it does have sort of dark fruit notes. So yeah, that might have worked. But even then, it's still too sweet.
It's like maybe one of the stout categories, actually, right?
Regardless, I think you need that bitterness. I think it's so low. I can't think of a dark beer style that has bitterness this low. Even a milk stout has some bitterness. This almost has none.
The sheet I have in front of me says the IBU was 52. At least calculated through Beersmith was 52.
I mean, so I just took another sip of it. It's warmed up a little bit. There's a little bit of bitterness there, but again, that could be just some astringency from the cinnamon because the cinnamon's now starting to really shine through at this point. The other thing I guess I didn't really talk about too much, I think the roast is a little low for this style. American porter, it shouldn't be over the top roasty like a American stout, but there should be a good roast component that it should dry out that beer quite a bit in the finish. And the only drying I'm getting at the end, again, is sort of that vanilla, or a little bit of that cinnamon astringency. I mean, it's just a touch. It's not that obnoxious, but I think a little bit of roast, a little bit more bitterness would go a long way to kind of counter it. I mean, it's a little out of balance for me. And for an American porter and for this style, again, you're adulterating a base style. And if you're not making it any better or any different in a better way, it's going to take a hit. And unfortunately, that's what happened with this beer.
Yeah, whatever the brewer does, they need to not take my previous comments about pastry porter seriously and try to actually fucking run with that, because then I'll be really unhappy, because next thing you know, this thing's going to be loaded up with fucking lactose and all that other bullshit, and then I'll be just really off the rails mad. I think it's a good beer. I would drink a bunch of it. Totally agree with what Nick's saying. This is definitely one of those things where minor tweaks to your recipe, really looking at the BJCP guidelines and tasting your beer side by side with it. But I think overall it's a really good beer. All right, so that wraps up another tasting session for us. Thanks to the brewer for sending this in for us. Nick, again, appreciate the time, taking us through the style. We almost went down the rabbit hole of stout versus porter again, but we didn't. We stayed disciplined this time, so that was great. All right, but thanks, guys, and we'll catch up again next time.
If you like what you've been hearing on our show, hit that subscribe or follow button on your podcast service. And if you have any ideas or feedback for us, leave us a review or shoot us a DM on Instagram at StrikeMashBoil. Or join the conversation in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/MVHBC.
So as Phil mentioned at the top of the show, this week we have Justin Negrotti joining us. Justin is one of the founders of Channel Marker Brewing and head brewer, and just so happens to have been a home brewer before turning pro, and even was a member of Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club before that. So Channel Marker is becoming widely known for their New England IPAs and fruited sours, which we'll obviously get into later on. And then we also have joining us today, James Hoyt, who is one of our other members in the club. Guys, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
So first off, since this is your first times on the show, we're going to both ask you our quick fire questions to get to know you a little bit. So in the Q&A form, why don't we have Justin answer first, and then James, you can follow up. So first up, what's your favorite beer style?
For me, it would be New England style double IPA.
For me, it would be a New England IPA as well.
All right. What's your least favorite beer style?
Ooh.
Cream ale.
For me, it would be the ones that re-ferment after I purchase it, and when I reach out to the brewer, they find a way to make it my fault because I didn't store it cold enough.
Sorry, time out. Is that an oxymoron from James? Is James oxymoron himself? Because I think some of your favorite styles are also the ones that are doing that.
Guilty as charged.
What is your favorite brewing ingredient?
Hops.
Oh, I was going to say hops, but I'm going to pivot to water since that's kind of what I do for a living. I kind of enjoy the water treatment side of things.
Okay. Least favorite beer ingredient?
Oh, least favorite brewing ingredient. PAA, parasitic acid.
Okay.
For sanitization purposes.
Gotcha.
Turns your skin white.
Spoken like a true businessman.
Yeah.
For me, I'm going to say fresh fruit because I've yet to properly execute a beer using that ingredient.
What piece of brewing equipment could you never live without?
Our ZOM, which is a piece of equipment that's used to test carbonation levels.
Those are probably pretty important when you're canning.
Canning, kegging, at any point when you're trying to understand exactly how many volumes of CO2 have dissolved into your beer.
I'm going to go with my hop spider. I don't think I could brew on a grain father without it.
That'd be pretty tough, I think. What piece of brewing equipment do you think is overrated?
I would say a filter, actually. If you have proper whirling techniques and you're willing to let your beer rest for a good portion of time, I think you can actually dump most of your trub prior to knockout and not clog heat exchangers or pumps or things like this.
Okay.
We really should rethink me following the pro here because my answers feel a little mundane in comparison. But it's hard for me to pick something that I think's overrated because I like to have all of the things. So I guess the one thing that comes to mind is I bought a carboy cleaning drill bit thinking that was going to save my life on cleaning days, but it's still in the packaging.
I have one of those, and I think I've used it all of like twice. What dream piece of brewing equipment if money was not a factor?
It's interesting that you asked this question, Phil. So we're in the process right now of finalizing a new financing package that is going to result in us expanding operations here at Channel Marker. And one of the items that I was advocating for was a device called a Gehaltometer. And it requires about 10 milliliters of wort or finished beer. And along the way, this will test total dissolved oxygen at various stages in the brewing process. And it's a $25,000 piece of brewing equipment that we are in the process right now of arguing for or against between myself and my two partners. I'm in the camp that if we're going to be expanding our brewing operations, we need to be prepared for the potential that our beer will end up on store shelves, and knowing with confidence our TPO or TDO is that's pretty critical for me, and we'll see if I win that battle. But ultimately that's a piece of equipment that I have my eyes on and I'll be advocating for.
Yeah, I daydream quite frequently about going to a multi-vessel electric brew system and maybe portioning out a piece of my garage and turning it into a brewery. It's not imminent, but that's my dream.
I feel like we put James in this horrible position. It's like Justin's talking about, I want a $25,000 piece of equipment. James like, I'd love this $1,000.
Yeah, I'll just take just the leftovers.
Yeah. Hand me downs, please.
I feel like James is in a tough spot no matter where he goes in this question answer section. All right, here's going to be a tough one. What beer topic, subject, style do you wish would just go away?
I mean, there's so many. I would say the argument of whether fruited sour beers are beer or not, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, but maybe a little more snarky, that this idea that people who like milkshake IPAs and pastry stouts might not like the taste of beer.
Oh, boy.
We picked the right two guys for this show.
All right. What is your desert island beer?
It's easy. That's going to be Julius by Treehouse.
I think I'm going to go Everett Hill Farmstead.
Isn't it a porter?
It is, yeah.
Throwing the curveball there.
I know. That beer gets me, man. I've made the pilgrimage.
Having lived on a deserted island before, that's a heavy beer to be sipping on a beach. When you're not in the mood for beer, what is your go-to cocktail?
Bacardi and Diet.
Bourbon for me.
Yeah, that's what Marco's drinking tonight. All right. So
it's that kind of night.
When kids are putting up a fight, you gotta up the ante.
So getting into this, Justin, what got you into home brewing?
It was really a couple of things for me. So I went to school for business, finance, and for tech. As I started studying business, I don't know, I got this itch in my belly to eventually want to start my own business. Didn't know what at the time when I was 20, 21 years old, what I wanted to do, but I knew I someday wanted to own my own business. And I figured that at the right point in time in my life, that opportunity would present itself. And so that, I guess that kind of all started the desire to do something entrepreneurial. Fast forward a couple of years, I, just after getting into craft beer with my two best friends, two lifelong friends, we were all talking about, geez, like, we're going out and spending tons and tons of money on good craft beer, visiting craft breweries. Like, wouldn't it be cool if we could, someday get involved with the industry? For anyone that knows me, I'm not really a guy that tends to go into something at less than 100%. So I got this idea in my head that I was going to learn how to brew beer, and started at night. This was before I had kids. Started reading everything I could about water profiles, grist, hops, everything that I could. I was just reading. Just through scouring Facebook, ended up by chance stumbling upon a picture of a beer that one of your current members, Joe Devanna, had brewed. Started reaching out to him and saying, hey, how did you brew beer that looks like the stuff that I'm buying out of Treehouse? After enough question asking, Joe finally said, dude, why don't you just come to my house in Everett? I think you live in Beverly, right? Because you're stalking me on Facebook. And I was like, yep, I live in Beverly and not too far from you. And he's like, why don't you just come and spend a day brewing, beer with me? And I said, okay, I'll do that.
Yeah, let me jump in for a sec. Had you brewed beer before that point?
I had brewed one batch of beer in my garage. Friends graciously drank this beer that I'm not even sure it fermented, to be quite honest. I don't think I even had the tools at that point to tell whether fermentation had completed. So no, I had not brewed beer up like what I would qualify as beer at that point. So
what type of system were you brewing on?
This was a pot that I fermented in, a carboy, transferred it into bottles, had no temperature control or anything like this, no hydrometer, no adequate means to determine, what was my knockout gravity or anything like that. I go to Joe's house in Everett, having never met the guy. And, I'm sure you guys have all been to Joe's house. He's got a nice keezer, and I go into his kitchen and he's got this big, beautiful poster board that he's got all chalked up, and he's got 6 beers on draft, and he's pouring me beers, and I'm tasting them, and I'm like, wow, like, what is this guy doing brewing in Everett? Like, why does this guy not own a brewery? These beers are all great. We ended up brewing an Imperial Pilsner that day, Dick Pills, if I remember correctly. If you guys have ever had that beer.
We sure have.
Yeah. That kind of kickstarted me on my journey. I ended up acquiring pieces of equipment along the way, all along the way, kind of feeding off of Joe, asking him questions, and I don't know. I'm sure you guys have great things to say about Joe, but I'm going to gush here and just say that my journey into craft beer would never have flourished into what it is now without him. I think he's just an invaluable resource that is just a total open book and willing to answer any questions, dumb or not. Just an incredible resource for anyone in your club that should absolutely have no hesitation about reaching out to Joe for any question.
So this is pretty interesting because, I'm thinking back to when you joined the club. It wasn't that long after you hooked up with Joe. You were basically a virgin when you joined the club.
Pretty much started, just attending every brew day that Joe was embarking on. If my job at the time, I was working still work in financial tech sales. Our company was in the process of being acquired, so I had a bit of flexibility that, just life afforded me. So I was attending every brew day that I possibly could with Joe. I don't know. I probably did 20 or 30 different brew days with Joe up in Everett. Ended up starting, brewing my own beer along the way, and also reaching out to breweries along the way and saying, hey, can I come just sit and watch? And you'd be surprised at how many breweries are open to just you coming in and asking questions and just watching and just participating and asking questions. Along that way, started brewing in my garage with my two friends. Joe would come and hang out with us at points. I think through all the reading that I did, through all of the watching of Joe that I did, through all the, quite honestly, the drinking that I did with New England style IPAs, and just really trying to dissect beers and approach it from a scientific mindset, ended up stumbling upon some recipes and just having some conversations and having folks review the recipes that I was brewing, and water profiles and hopping and things like this, that for whatever reason, folks started to come by our garage and try our beers and give feedback, and that kind of cascaded into into our business plan. Along that way, Joe definitely encouraged me to join the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, which I did. Certainly a pinnacle moment for me was our brew day over at Navigation Brewing Company, where we brewed, I think it was a
Saison.
A Saison? Hoppy Saison,
yep,
with Sriracha Ace, if I remember correctly. And that beer ended up getting infected on me because I didn't properly sanitize my sample port on my plastic carboy. So that taught me the value of taking apart all your pieces on your carboys when you're going to be fermenting. So had a conversation with PJ kind of off to the side and said, hey, I'm at some point I'm looking to get into the brewing industry. Any advice that you got for me? And he's like, hey, here's my number. Call me, text me. I'm an open book. Certainly picked his brain and continue to this day on that and take him up on that offer. But that certainly kind of just a cascading effect into things rolling to where they are today. Certainly lots of pivotal moments along that way, which I'm happy to talk about, but I don't want to dominate the conversation with our story.
Well, considering, so this is also pretty interesting. You were in the club for about a year, maybe a little bit longer than that. It wasn't that long. So considering the obstacles that Massachusetts creates for people to open breweries, fucking did this in record time.
Well,
it seems pretty fast from starting to brew, hooking up with Joe, joining the club. I mean, it seems like a really short period of time, and you created a business plan and opened a brewery in that time.
So I would say there was about a 6-month window where I latched onto Joe, learned everything that I could about brewing, started brewing in my garage. At that point, we were brewing beer we felt was good enough to bring at least to our friends and family and say, what do you think of this stuff? Like, is this are we on the right direction? One of the beers that we were brewing was fruited sour beer at that time. That was kind of one of the beers that folks really kind of dove into and said, like, geez, like, we've never had beer like this around here. Like, what is this? What are you doing? So we kind of built, a core portfolio of, say, 4 to 5, 6 beers that we felt like this is what we're going to, at least try and scale up on a professional scale and develop a business plan. I had been in touch with, along the way, Dino Fernaria of Vitamin C at the time, and said to him, hey, Dino, I know you guys are exploding on social media and you guys are planning on opening up a shop in a year. Like, what are the trials and tribulations you're going through of trying to open up a brewery on a fast track here? And he's like, here's the name of my lawyer. He's up in Portland, Maine, works for a really good law firm. If there's anything I can suggest to you, it's to hire a really good lawyer who can help fast track the permitting process for everything that goes on in Massachusetts. After talking to my two business partners, that was something that kind of we made the decision day one that we were not going to spare a penny on, was legal help. Our lawyer basically took us A to Z through the first day that we started talking to him through, here's your certificate of occupancy. Like, he fast tracked that process immensely, and that resulted in us paying money. But at the end of the day, I mean, we got our doors open in what I would consider to be record time relative to other brewers who are, kind of still muddling through the process. My recommendation out there would be to anybody that's considering getting into the commercial brewing industry and going into business for yourself, be willing to pay for good help, because at the end of the day, paying for good help will result in you making money faster, or you opening your doors faster.
Yeah, time is money, no matter how you look at it.
Time is money. Time is money.
Yeah. So fast forward to today, we have Channel Marker, which many people probably don't know this, but it wasn't always Channel Marker. It was what was the name before?
Agape Brewing Company.
There was somebody else that had that name or something close to it, right? It was something wacky like that.
I believe she's now out of business. But yeah, she had reached out to us when she caught wind of us. To be quite honest, Agape was the name of the preschool that my partner Tim and I had attended back in, 1992 or something. We just kind of picked that name, and all of a sudden she caught wind of it, like within 2 or 3 weeks of us kind of posting on social media, like not knowing what the F we were doing.
Yeah, sure.
And reaching out and saying, I'm going to sue your asses if you don't change your name. And we were like, whoa, okay. Like,
was she a brewery?
She
supply store or something?
She was I know she's out of business now, but essentially she was going to be a place where you could go and actually learn how to brew beer. I think she actually had her beer in stores for a few weeks, but again, we kind of just said, you know what, like we're not here to like step on any toes. It was a name that came out of the preschool that Tim and I had attended. Like, we're not looking to step on any toes here and take the name. Like, we'll figure something else out.
Yeah, personally, I think Channel Marker is a much better name anyway.
Channel Marker is a much better name, so it kind of fit the bill.
Yeah, totally. But all right, so fast forwarding to today, those who are Channel Marker fans know that you guys are known for New England IPAs. You've been recognized, across the country. I've read lists where you guys were called out as best new brewery or best up and coming brewery, and so your New England IPA game has been recognized. Mm-hmm. On Untapped, I think I mentioned this on our social media page recently. You guys, your beers average a 4 or higher, so the people do definitely love your beers. So you guys make this name for yourselves in New England IPAs and fruited sours. Was that always the plan, or did you just fall into that niche for you guys? You're like, we're doing them well, people like them, we're going to keep going it, or was that the plan?
So New England IPA was definitely kind of the brand or the style that we intended to make our name on. When we introduced our fruited sour program, the Siren series, which is a fruited ale with lactose, all the fruits added post fermentation, all of a sudden that kind of spotlighted our brewery as being a one in the area that brewed the style of beer that no one else was brewing, at least to the levels that we were in terms of the fruit saturation and things like this. So that was a bullet point in the business plan when we were talking about the points that were going to differentiate us versus the local competition. It was a point of mention, but certainly not the spotlight or the first bullet on our list of things that was going to separate us from our competitors. It's funny, I was actually looking at the data from all the brewing logs from 2020, and it really wasn't until COVID hit that our sour program really started to take off and flourish into the business line that it is today.
Was there, because when you were getting yourself prepared for opening up your brewery, and you were doing a lot of brewing with Joe, and you had this idea that part of your model was going to be these types of beers. Was there a huge learning curve when you started doing it on that bigger
Oh,
brewing system?
huge. I can't even talk about the many number of changes and iterations and changes that, like last week, we've continued to make to our sour brewing process. I think, when I think back to my home brewing days with Joe, I was brewing, basically boiling wort, and I'd boil, a batch of homebrew for 60 minutes, pitch it into my plastic fermenter, and actually pitch the lactobacillus blend that we were using at the time into the wort and let it sit, and basically, for the next, call it 3 to 6 weeks, taste test it along the way until it developed into the kind of the sourness level that my palate was looking for. And at that point, we would pitch the yeast, and we would see horrible attenuation. I don't know, 40% or so. When we scaled that up to the homebrew level, we, as soon as we started to talk to other breweries that were doing kettle sour beers, at the time when we were homebrewing, we didn't have any way to, kettle sour per se. It was basically boil your wort, throw it into your carboy or bucket, pitch your lacto, wait till it kind of soured to taste, and then pitch your yeast on top of that and ferment it out as best you could. So, for us, that process changed dramatically from when we, from the first batch that we started kettle souring in at Channel Marker. Thankfully, again, we spent good money partnering with a really reputable, what I would consider reputable, brewing system provider in stout tanks and kettles out of Portland, Oregon. And when we talked to them about the styles of beer that we were intended to brew, they kind of led us in the direction of, hey, if you're going to do New England style IPAs, you need to consider these different elements of your brewing system. And if you're going to be brewing kettle sours, you need to make sure that you can actually seal off your boil kettle from the environment, and make sure that you can purge it with CO2, and you can keep it at the temperature that you want, and things like this. So we kind of made a good choice in going with stout out of the gate, and they were very directive in terms of these are the particular facets of your brewing system that you really want to consider investing in, so that you can brew the styles of beer that you're looking for.
Yeah, we interacted with those guys at HomebrewCon, and their stuff was pretty awesome. Like, they had an awesome system.
For anyone that's considering going commercial, or really kind of taking their homebrew game up to the next level beyond just kind of open boiling and pitching into fermenters that are plastic, or even some of the stuff that SS Brewtech offers, which I think is great. If you're really kind of looking to take your game up to the next level, and you're, really starting to think about, okay, eventually I'd like to go commercial, or, go down that path, I would absolutely encourage you guys to check out Stout Tanks and Kettles, because we're about 2 weeks away right now from pulling the trigger on a 5-barrel system with them, and they've been nothing but helpful and great to work with.
James, write that down, because I think there's going to be a system coming available pretty soon. You might need to upgrade.
There's not. We are going to hold on to that 2-barrel for as long as we possibly can.
That was my question. So you guys are you started with a 2-barrel system then?
Yeah. So we were brewing out of my garage on a 10, and a 10 being basically a manually constructed system, most of which Joe helped me build.
10 gallons? 10
gallons.
Okay.
10 gallons. Yep. So we were brewing on a 10-gallon pot and pan, SS Brewtech mash tun. Thing was a workhorse. We beat it to hell, but did the job great. I had at one point I had, I think, four different refrigerators operating in my garage, and my wife was screaming at me because of the electric bill that was going off in the summertime when we were brewing 4 gallons or 4 batches at a time. But yeah, we're a two-barrel brew house at Channel Marker. So we have we get a mash tun, a HLT, and a boil kettle, 90-gallon boil kettle. We have 5 2-barrel fermenters and 2 2-barrel brights. So they look pretty, but they're definitely fucking small.
I'm curious, and I think this is the question that every listener has right now, and that is, what percent equity does Joe have in Channel Marker, and or how much royalties is he getting from Channel Marker? I want to say that Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club is responsible for Channel Marker existing, but it's really Joe. But if it wasn't for Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, there would be no Joe, there would be no, so we sort of take some credit for it. So there should be a sub bullet somewhere, say Channel Marker brought to you by Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club / Joe Devanna. But seriously, how much equity does he have in the business? Is he one of the partners?
Well, unfortunately, Joe got his equity slashed the minute that negativities were said on Facebook about our sour beer. There was a clause in there that said if any backlash was to be had publicly on our beers, Joe's equity was to be dissolved. And
that explains why Joe's not talking to us anymore.
Oh boy.
Yes.
Well, we'll get into that in a second. I know that's one of the reasons why we're here, right? Obviously, some huge differences in home brewing to pro brewing, especially when you're taking that leap in the size of the system. Mm-hmm. Curious though, like how did recipe development change?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut Marco off there. Much like the opening segment of the show, we're going to have to finish our talk with Justin on next week's episode. An exciting show next week as we'll finish talking through the recipe development for New England Pale Ale. Mr. Matt Savage is back to judge a Czech Amber Lager, and we'll finish this talk with Justin. All that next week here on Strike, Mash, Boil. The Strike Mash Boil podcast is produced by the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, an AHA-sanctioned club. Follow us on Instagram at Strike Mash Boil. Join the conversation in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/MVHBC, or send us some feedback at strikemashboil@mvhbc.com.